Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all here today, this afternoon. My name is Tamar Gore.
Go back. Sorry.
Oh, go back. Oh, no. Spoiler alert. Don't avert your eyes. I'm so sorry, Dr. Owens. This is going so well. Now that we're all friends, my name is Tamar Gore. I have the pleasure of serving as the Sally Ross Soder Endowed Director of the Women's Health Research Program here. And I just think it's incredibly important that we understand and learn the history of women's health research as we launch this new era of women's health research here at Ohio State. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 21st Annual John C. Burnham Lecture. This lecture series in the history of medicine and science was established in 2000 with gifts from John C. Burnham's wife, Marjorie Burnham, to establish an annual lecture in his honor. The Department of History and the Medical Heritage Center of the Health Sciences Library jointly host this annual lecture. Since its inception, 20 individuals have been honored as Burnham lecturers. Our speaker tonight is the 21st Burnham Lecture. John C. Burnham was a leading international figure in the fields of history of medicine and science. He wrote more than 80 major scholarly articles, many of which have been reprinted and are considered classics. He also wrote 10 books and edited 4. And as an associate professor still, I can tell you that's an incredible lift, and I'm really impressed. 2 of his books have won prizes. 1 has been translated into Japanese, and 2 have been translated into Chinese, really a mark of his international influence. Professor Burnham taught at Stanford and Claremont colleges, and he was a Fulbright senior lecturer in Australia at the universities of Melbourne, Tasmania, and New England. He also served as the Tolman Visiting Professor at Bowdoin College. In 2002 to 2003, he was a visiting fellow at Robinson College at the University of Cambridge. He served as the president of the American Association for the History of Medicine, and he held many other offices in scholarly organizations both in the United States and abroad, and he was a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was the 2014 recipient of the American Association for the History of Medicine Lifetime Achievement Award. Dr. Burnham was a research professor of history and held a courtesy appointment in my own department, the Department of Psychiatry at Ohio State. He was an affiliated scholar of the Medical Heritage Center. We are grateful to his wife, Marjorie, for establishing this namesake lecture that will keep his legacy alive at The Ohio State University and beyond. At this time, I'd like to introduce Alice Conklin, Vice Chair of the Ohio State Department of History, who will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Put this somewhere, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gore. It's my great pleasure here today to help introduce our 2025 John C. Burnham Lecture in the History of Medicine and Science. I'd like to begin by thanking Marjorie Burnham and family for their generosity, which has supported this lecture series for 21 years, as Dr. Gore just said. Unfortunately, Marjorie is unable to join us in person today, but we are excited to have John's 2 daughters, Melissa Carlston and Abby Barnes, and one of John's sons, Peter Burnham, and Peter's wife, Cindy, in the audience. Thank you to the entire Burnham family for your continuing support. So now it's my privilege to introduce our distinguished 2025 speaker, Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. Prior to her current appointment, she simultaneously directed both the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia and the Medical Humanities program at the University of Nebraska. During that time, she was the only Black woman in this country who served as director of an academic medical humanities program. Dr. Cooper Owens is a popular public speaker and nationally recognized reproductive justice advocate and scholar, who has appeared as a historical expert in documentaries such as The Cancer Detective, podcasts such as Untextbooked and For Harriet, and several television newscasts. She is an Organization of American Historians, what we in the Guild call the OAH, distinguished lecturer. She's a past American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Fellow and a member of the American Antiquarian Society. Her extensive work and contributions in this field have earned her the recognition of Time magazine as one of the country's best historians. Dr. Cooper Owens has also won several prestigious honors and awards for her scholarly and advocacy work in history and reproductive and birthing justice. She was awarded the OAH Darlene Clark Hine Book Award for her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, up there as you see, which was cited as the best book written in African American women's and gender history. It was published in 2017. She's currently working on 2 projects, a popular biography about Harriet Tubman that will examine her life through the lens of disability, and a historical monograph about race, medical discovery, and the C-section. In her 15 years working as a reproductive justice advocate and historian, she has worked with grassroots community groups, birth workers, and artists, and served as a consultant and historical expert to hospitals as well as the United States Congress. We are so honored and grateful to have Dr. Cooper Owens here today to give her lecture entitled Why Slavery Still Matters, examining the genealogy of American gynecology. She will cover not only the genealogical origins of modern gynecology, but also the roots of racialized health disparities in the United States. More specifically, she will explain how the institution of slavery in the U.S. was directly linked to the creation of reproductive medicine in this nation, and provide context for how and why Black women were valued as, scare quotes, medical superbodies, that is to say, highly suited for experimentation, but denied their full humanity. This important and timely lecture will shed light on the legacy of medical racism and what we should do to create birthing and medical equity for all in this country. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens as the 2025 John Burnham Memorial Lecture in the History of Medicine and Science.
Wow, that sounds great. I often joke, that sounds so impressive on paper. And then I'm reminded of the humdrum nature of my life when I have to change my cat's litter box. Thank you all so much for having me. And I want to thank all of those who worked to bring me here from the Ohio State University, from Scott, Kristen, Alice, I might be forgetting names, but thank you so much. Also to the members of the Burnham family that I met briefly as we were walking in. I have to say that your father's legacy lives on. I am a board member for the AAHM, and he was a former president and has served as an editor for the journal that he also edited. And so, you know, he is still greatly impacting the lives of contemporary scholars. And also thank you to all of you for coming out and listening to a bit of our past about slavery. The thing is, when I first started to give talks, I would have folk crying to me, and then some folk didn't know. They're like, is she an actual medical doctor or historian of medicine? So they were asking me about the problems, and I was like, so I study dead people who lived centuries ago. And so I also had to learn to kind of pivot in a way and just kind of bring my personality. And so I hope to make this inspiring, but also inform you about the past. And also, you know, this can be something where we can have a conversation, particularly during the Q&A. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and answering your questions. So why does slavery matter when we're talking about gynecology? And so I remember not knowing much about the history of medicine and African American history except for Tuskegee. So I got my PhD from UCLA, and I entered in 2002, graduated in '08, but I remember around 2005, I was taking a research seminar. It was the most boring one I had ever taken. No offense to people who are interested in the steam engine, but it was about the scientific revolution, and I was like, oh my God, what, how do I, somehow juxtapose slavery and science? And I've always had a gift for gab, and I was going to moderate a panel that was a conversation between Gynecology, who was then president of my alma mater, Bennett College, an HBCU for women, and then Reverend James Lawson, who was a civil rights pioneer. So like any good host, I read a book that she published along with Beverly Guy Sheftel called Gender Talk. And literally 3 sentences captured my imagination. I was shocked. It talked about this guy named James Marion Sims and his experimentation on enslaved women. And so I thought, well, wait, I went to Bennett College, a black women's college, for my BA. I have an MA in African American Studies from Clark Atlanta University, and I was like, how didn't I know this? So I called my mother, who has a degree in biology, and she's a science teacher at the time. She's now retired. And I was like, so Mother, had you ever heard of medical experimentation on enslaved women? Well, back then we said slave. This is before the field adopted enslaved. So she was like, no, we didn't even know about Henrietta Lacks. So I thought, this might be a good idea to write a dissertation. And so I started to uncover a lot over the years, Sims's work on enslaved women, but also poor Irish immigrant women when he moved to New York. And then I started to see that he wasn't the only one. And oftentimes when we read books about history, we kind of read these great men or great women, histories that either pit people as heroes or as villains. Think about when we were kids and we all learned about Benedict Arnold, right? And so what I really wanted to do, what I think most historians want to do, is provide context. And so that's why I think, right, understanding the point of origin is so important, because when we hear these really damning statistics about the birthing crisis in the US, you think, how did this happen? And so for me, I'm like, well, if we scratch the surface and we peel back the layers, we'll see that there's a point of origin that happened in the 19th century. A little bit in the late 18th century, but largely in the 19th century. So I get the big stuff out the way first. Medical racism, right? Not just a term that we bandy about, but what did it actually mean, right? Now I know for the historians, especially the historians of medicine, we have heard of this gentleman to my left, Samuel Cartwright. So Dr. Samuel Cartwright was a prolific medical writer. He received a medical degree from Transylvania University in Kentucky, and he was so well respected amongst his peers that he was asked by the Louisiana State Medical Association in the early 1850s to conduct research on the Negro race and the white race, to see what differences existed between the two races. And so he agreed and he commenced to researching. Now, he was a slave-only physician, which is not that, unusual for someone of his standing and someone who lived in the South. And so he conducts research on Negro subjects who are all enslaved. And he found some really interesting things, right? He found that, in fact, black people had thicker skin, that if a black person was sassy, they suffered from rascality. That might have been me in the 1850s. He found all of these differences, right? And then also the most, kind of the infamous claim was that if a Negro harbored the thought of running away or actually ran away from bondage, that person was mentally ill. And I mean, there were these other claims as well. You can Google it, it's on the public domain. He had an article that even in the 1850s, it elicited a lot of conversation. So some of his peers were like, come on, man, like this, no, this isn't true. And then there were others who were like, yes. But I often tell my students, especially when I was running a medical humanities program, I said, why do you think a state medical association would ask a doctor to conduct this kind of research? Was it solely to understand the differences between the races, or something else? And this is where, my health allied students would be offended and shocked that I dare claim that even STEM folk are not as objective as they think, right? Because the Louisiana State Medical Association is asking a professional, a respected medical researcher to conduct this research on the Negro race because there had been tensions brewing, right, between the North and the South. And what we do know is exactly a decade after Cartwright's publication, the country is torn apart, right? And we have the beginning of the Civil War. And so there's a political dimension behind proving that slavery is in fact a benefit and a civilizing institution for Black people. Now the thing is, Cartwright is really pioneering some of this binary research between Black and white people. And so he continues looking at the Negro race and the white race. And if you look to my far left, you'll see the cover of a book by a dearly departed colleague, Lundy Braun, who taught for many years at Brown University. But she wrote this wonderful book called Breathing Race into the Machine. And the machine she's talking about is the spirometer. We still use it today. But it was an advanced and new technological tool that assessed lung capacity. Sam Cartwright did not develop the spirometer, but he is trying to perfect it and he's working to redevelop it. And what he finds in his studies is, in fact, when he tested white patients and Black patients, right, all of the Black patients were still enslaved, but when he tested them, he found that Black people had lessened lung capacity. Now, lest we think that this was some new claim, he's building on older research. So in the very early 19th century, Thomas Jefferson, in his only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he wrote about the lessened lung capacity of the Negro race. In 1799, and in fact, the actual speech was in 1794, but Benjamin Rush, the only founding father with a medical degree, also spoke about the lessened lung capacity of Black people. So this is the thing, right? Cartwright's work was so influential and persuasive that the Union Army, not the Confederate, but the Union Army uses his findings and the spirometer to test whether Black men were fit enough to fight in the Civil War, right? And this is a really interesting thing. If we kind of move the historical thread from the 19th century and the 20th century to the 21st century, the spirometer is still used. I don't know how many of us have gone into the hospital. We've literally breathed into the machine. And this is the thing. Now I don't have on my glasses, but I'm gonna assume Alice is a white woman, right? Look, y'all are laughing. I met a Black man at Clark Atlanta University in my master's program, my husband, bless him, and he looks just as white as anybody in here. He sounds like his Black dad, he looks like his white mama. So, I can't make assumptions, right? And so let's just assume we look different. But let's say we have the same reading on the spirometer. This is the thing. A medical practitioner has to press buttons to change my reading because I'm Black, for no other scientific reason than what was happening in the 19th century. Still going on to this day, right? So when people are talking about these kinds of findings not being based on anything but kind of old school, outdated, misinformed 18th and 19th century racial science, right? There's a reason for it. Now, like I said, I write about people who lived in the late 18th century and the 19th century. But this is the really interesting thing, the kind of byline, right, that carries through. In 2014, Kelly Hoffman was a doctoral student at the University of Virginia. And she decided to do a research project on perception of pain between two groups of people, Black people and white people. So she and her research team, they set up these questionnaires with, the patients are experiencing the same problems, right? Identical twin cases. Except the difference is one fictitious patient is black and the other is white. She and her research team, they give the study or the sample residents and med students at the University of Virginia's School of Medicine, with some of the faculty also answering the questions. Now, as we know, and I'll say this as someone who did her postdoc at UVA, it's a pretty elite school. It's highly competitive. So these are not people who, are coming in with correspondence degrees. These are students who were the best of the best of the best. And many of them had already undergone their white coat ceremony. They had taken the MCAT, they had done all the things to get to this really elite place. And so she asks them questions about pain. Right? And so if the black patient is complaining of kidney stones, which we all know is very painful, right? The medical students and residents have a different response than if a white person complained of pain because of kidney stones. Or childbirth, or, she had a number of conditions that we consider painful. And so I'm not going to read all of it because you all are literate, but what she found was these students, under the cloak of anonymity, when they were asked to assess the patients, they believed that the black patients had not suffered pain, and if they had, it was very minimal. They believed black patients were drug seeking. Many of them believed that in fact 67% believed that black people had thicker skin. They believed that black people aged quicker. 2 of the respondents believed that black people were born with tails. It was published in 2016, not even a decade ago. I always say this, it's Googleable, right? It's Googleable. You can go on Google right now as I'm speaking, because it was pretty famous. I mean, it made a huge splash. These are some of the claims that Sam Cartwright wrote about, black people having thicker skin. He said black people had a propensity for dirt eating. But let me tell you how these things come about. Well, guess why people were eating clay and dirt when they were enslaved? Vitamin and mineral deficiencies, right? Let me tell you why people who live in slave cabins that didn't have good ventilation or insulation, fireplaces are in these one-room spaces, they have less in lung capacity because they can't breathe. Today we would say these are negative social determinants of health, right? That in fact slavery is or was a disabling device. So we can make sense of this in the 19th century. But how do we make sense of this in the 21st century, right? And so although I wrote a dissertation and later a book about people who lived in the past, I have to be honest with you, I was really concerned about the ways that it could speak to a present moment. I think the role of history is to inform folk, to fill in the gaps, right? To be able to have certain, issues and themes resonate with us. And sometimes, if we're lucky, right, it can provide a blueprint for what not to do and where we can go. So the other thing that I was really interested in was also, kind of exploding this idea that we are talking about good and bad people, because I wasn't really interested in that at all, right? And so the way that Sims had been written about before was this narrative of he was a barbaric, evil monster who mangled the body parts of enslaved women, and it was simply for his gain. And he was always, pitched as exceptional. So either for those protecting his legacy or for those who wanted to demolish his legacy, right? And so I wasn't interested in whether he was a savior or a monster. I wasn't even interested in his exceptionality, because what I knew was he was not the first person to do this kind of work. And most certainly, slavery allowed him access to these bodies. And so what I wanted to do was really, kind of go backwards and find out, how did this start? How did he inherit this legacy, right, of thinking about, writing about, and ultimately treating Black patients who were enslaved in a particular way, right? What formed his belief system? So I have to tell you a little bit of autobiography. So I shared that my mother had her degree in biology, and she becomes a science teacher. My father worked at the National Archives for over 30 years. So genealogy is something, like, I hated it as a kid, and I was like, wait, look at what I'm doing all these decades later, right? And so I call my first chapter my Roots chapter. For you undergrads, Roots was a television series that was created in 1977 based on Alex Haley's book about his family. We later know he plagiarized a lot of it, but nevertheless, right, this is my Roots chapter. So I go all the way back to kind of like the big fathers of the Western medical tradition. And I start with a French-born natural historian, as he was called back then, named Georges Cuvier. And Cuvier was really important. He had done significant research. But why am I interested in this man when I'm interested in slavery, and in particular Black women's treatment and participation in the history of gynecology? I will tell you why. There was a South African-born woman named Saartjie Baartman. Her anglicized name was Sarah Baartman, but she was unfortunately given the nickname the Hottentot Venus when she was sold by her owner, who was in South Africa. He sold Saartjie to his brother and his business partner, the brother's business partner, and they take her to England, and she becomes essentially a sideshow freak. She is made to wear flesh-colored clothing, where she's kind of partially nude. She's made to dance and move around. And the reason that these men and later English audiences are so interested in Saartjie Baartman, the Hottentot Venus, is because of the size of her buttocks. Essentially, she has a big butt. That's it. But Cuvier, when she's sold to an animal keeper in France a few years later, Cuvier is able to have access to Baartman's body because he is the director over the menagerie at the National Museum of Paris. And so Saartjie Baartman is there, and Cuvier is really interested in trying to figure out, are Hottentots, right, these Black South Africans, are they the missing link between humans and primates? Does her body, right, show us things that are different, right, from other human beings? And so he wants to gain access to her, but she is resisting the entire time. Unfortunately, she dies in her 20s, and Cuvier finally has full access to her body, and he performs an autopsy on her cadaver. And so he takes out her brain, preserves it, puts it in a bell jar, finds it's a normal human brain. Takes out her genitalia, preserves it, puts it in a bell jar. Normal. He even cleans her skeleton, assembles it, right? And guess what we find? She doesn't look like anything else except a human being. Like, nobody's gonna look at this and think it's the skeleton of a cat, right, or a duck. You know it's a human being, right? So this kind of scientific critical inquiry into Baartman reveals that she's a human being. But the thing that interests me more was not necessarily that she was seen as this kind of this specimen for scientific observation. It's about the afterlife of slavery, right? So D.R. Hartman, this theorist, coined this term, right? So what's the afterlife of slavery, even for someone who is now just a skeleton, just remains? All of her body parts are put on display in the museum from 1813 until 1974. And that's when her brain and her genitalia were lost. They've never been found. Her skeleton was not sent back to South Africa until the 21st century. But what we do know, other scientists had access, right, to learning and observing this woman's remains. And it really sets up a blueprint for how other doctors begin to write about and think about the Black female body. Right? So Ephraim McDowell, most people have not heard of him, but he's called the father of the ovariotomy. So he is the man who is credited with having the first successful abdominal incision to remove ovarian tumors. And he does so on a white woman at first in Kentucky. He is a slave-owning physician, originally born in Virginia. His family moves out west, and it is, considered, the West is considered Kentucky, right? And so he is a medical apprentice, but he gets in a little bit of trouble. He and the other apprentice, they are angry that they cannot actually perform autopsies and examine patients. So when the doctor, it's a whole thing. The doctor is known as the town drunk. The doctor gets in a drunken stupor. Ephraim McDowell and the other apprentice go and they literally steal the body of a recently expired enslaved man. And they perform an autopsy. People found out in the town and they are going nuts. They're just like, how can you do this? This is unethical. You're a grave robber. The person who owned the cadaver, accuses them. And so what does Ephraim McDowell do? His parents, who are very wealthy, send him to Edinburgh, to arguably the best med school in the Western world. He comes back, a year or so later, and he's now a doctor. And this white woman, Mary Todd Crawford, approaches and she says, I know I'm not pregnant. I'm a mother. I have children. But my stomach is distended, I have this pain. He figures it out, and this is 1809. He figures out, I think you might have ovarian tumors. And so he still has this sketchy reputation with the townspeople. So he, along with Mary Todd Crawford's husband, decide they will sneak her into his office early on Christmas morning, around 7:30, he performs surgery, removes a tumor that's over 20 pounds. Miraculously, she lives. And this is 1809, right? Well before germ theory. And so now he has the idea, oh my gosh, I have to perfect my surgical technique. And so he writes 5 negresses. We don't know their names. Out of the 5 negresses, 4 enslaved, 1 is a free woman of color. He performs these surgeries on them over an 8-year period. So by 1817, he finally publishes his findings. And when he does, he thinks this is going to put me on the map. This new nation for which I am a citizen will be placed on a global map. And guess what happens? Doctors throughout the Western world deride him. And one of them, a Dr. Johnson, writes in The Lancet, which is still a well-respected medical journal to this day, coming out of England. He says, well, of course, this frontiersman, right, this backwoods doctor could perform surgery on these negresses. They can easily bear the cutting of the knife with the impunity of dogs and rabbits. That becomes important, not because of this kind of comparison to dogs and rabbits, animals that are seen to reproduce quickly, but this idea that somehow Black women, Black people don't experience pain. When folks were trying to attribute that to James Marion Sims, I'm saying he's not the first person to think of this, right? So here we have, right, very early 19th century, when Sims is still very young, not even in med school, we have folk from around the Western world writing about these ideas of Black difference. Dr. Francois Marie Provost, I have to tell you that some of the information on this historical marker is incorrect. But what we do know is Provost, French born, he moves to Donaldsonville, Louisiana, and becomes a pretty prosperous country doctor in the richest parish in the state, Ascension. And so he becomes the second American to perform 2 successful cesarean sections, both on enslaved women. The thing is, right, I don't know much. He doesn't leave a lot of writings. There have been some claims that he had worked on enslaved women in Haiti. I haven't found any information. But what I do know is Provost has access to these women's bodies, but not only does he have access to their bodies, he has so much power that he's able to name one of the children, Cesaria, after the operation. And so when we talk about, these ideas, right, that black women emasculated black men, and they are the ones who tore down the family. It's a whole thing called the Moynihan Report, written in the 20th century. You can Google that one too, right? And so I often say, well, what power do you have when you can't even name your own child? You're not the first person to touch your child. And how does this powerful man, how is he able to do this? He mortgages his plantation and his slaves. Now, what is equally as important to me, where I'm saying we don't need to have exceptions in the history of medicine, because typically they don't exist. Everybody kind of jumps on James Marion Sims. I have to tell y'all, I'm so tired of talking about Sims, because I'm like, look at these other folk, right? He was a part of a cohort of people producing knowledge, but doing so on the bodies of enslaved people. This is the line that literally hasn't been broken. Prevost performs those C-sections in 1831. Some sources say 1833, but the early 1830s. Until 2014, Louisiana remained the #1 state for the overuse of black women and birthing people for C-sections. The only state that knocked it to #2, Mississippi, which has the most populous black, the highest percentage of black folk living in the state. That's the only state that knocked it to #2. So I'm like, from 1831 to 1833 to 2014, that is literally a line that has not been broken. And many of those C-sections, particularly in places like New Orleans, are happening in Touros Hospital, Charity Hospital, places that used to be slave hospitals. John Peter Mattauer, he pioneers the obstetrical fistula surgery, the one that makes James Marion Sims famous. And he also, slave-owning physician, and he performs the obstetrical fistula surgery. Back then it was called vesico-vaginal fistula. Essentially, women, and it happened to all women. It didn't matter, your age, your race, your status. Essentially, it's a prolonged or protracted labor and delivery. And so these women are in labor for days. And there is, as you can imagine, you're trying to expel something from your body. So there's a lot of friction that's going on, which causes a fistula or hole and in the upper vaginal area. And right above the upper vaginal area is your bladder. And so the end result is incontinence. Now this is the thing, right? For any woman experiencing this, you have to think about the smell, the infection, right? You're going to be ostracized, all of these kinds of things. If you're enslaved, there's another layer, because it literally decreases your economic value as well. So this is a common condition, and there's no cure or fix, as doctors would say then. So Mattauer is interested in trying to fix, as he says, his patients. And so there's a white patient and a black patient around the same age, late teens, early 20s. They both gave birth, both suffered from vesico-vaginal fistula. And so he performs a suture technique using, I believe it was lead or either pewter sutures. Right? The white woman patient is healed. The enslaved woman patient is not. And he says he tries, in his words, for 8 clinical trials, right, over a number of years. She's still not healed. And so in his medical journal article, he writes, the patient could have been healed had she stopped engaging in sexual intercourse. Sir, you own enslaved people. You know good and well no enslaved woman has autonomy. She can't stop engaging in sexual intercourse if she wanted to. But what it reveals for me, right, as someone who looks at slavery and race and medicine and gender and all of these things, is slavery, once again, if we use 21st century language, negative social determinant. Right? The inability to rest, the inability to stop engaging, right, in intimate relations, does not allow this woman's body to heal. But it also is telling, because the negative medical outcome is not the fault of the doctor or even society. It becomes the patient's fault, right? And so oftentimes when, many of us, you will walk into the doctor's office and they ask you questions. Have you thought about losing weight? Well, wait a minute now. Like, I told them I'm 53, I got all 32 of my teeth and I don't take medicine for anything. Like, what are you talking about? I eat very healthy now. It's organic blueberries and it might be the whole carton, but nevertheless, they're organic blueberries, right? And so there's this way of, well, let's blame the patient instead of really trying to get to know what the issues are. I literally can look at some 20th century and 21st century medical journal articles, and the patient blaming is literally the same as in the 18th and 19th century. The negative medical outcome becomes the patient's fault and not the practicing physician. And then there's James Marion Sims, the father of American gynecology. Performs these surgeries, right, in the 1840s on a smattering of enslaved women in rural Alabama, and then they later moved to Montgomery. About 6 to 9, we're not sure. We only have the name of 3 of those women, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. They are suffering from the same condition, the vesicovaginal fistula or obstetrical fistula. And so Sims, right, says he canvassed the county for cases, and he had a little hospital built for himself. So that's the brick building to my far left. In fact, it's still standing in Montgomery today. And he commences for a number of years to try to find a correct surgical reparative treatment for these women. And he has 2 white male assistants. One of them is Nathan Bozeman, who later becomes one of his biggest critics. But they are literally excited about this venture, right? That they can possibly cure women of this common malady, right, that has made them, in his words, right, these miserable creatures, right? So he wants to be able to fix these women. And they invite the townspeople, the kind of, the creme de la creme, to come in and observe, and it's failure after failure after failure, until the townspeople begin to whisper, right? He keeps operating on these women like they're guinea pigs. The 2 surgical assistants eventually quit. His family begs him to stop. He doesn't. And so he does what any other slave-only physician would do. He trains his patients to serve as surgical assistants and nurses. Now, this is the thing. Even though I'm a historian of slavery, I write about people who do not leave written records. So how in the world am I understanding the lives of enslaved women when they have not left any records, right? It was against the law for them to be literate, and if they were, they had to hide it. So I have to read between the lines. What do the silences tell us? So what I do know is the racial fictions around Black people and their, intellectual state of arrested development is false, because if that's the case, Sims would have gotten 2 more white male surgical assistants. But the one thing he knows, like all other slave owners, right, and people invested in that institution, enslaved people are hardworking and they're smart, because you are not going to maintain a slave trade for centuries for people who are dumb and lazy. It doesn't make sense, right? Because it's an economic institution as well. So he trains these illiterate women. Now, this is the thing. They're Black, so they're supposed to be in a state of arrested development, but they're also women, which means they're a subset of men. But all of a sudden, when these women become, even though they're patients, they become the surgical assistants and his nurses, all of a sudden, he has surgical success. Now, that's how I read the silences, right? Where does the success come from? The surgical team that he trains who can't even read. And we don't know why, right? Maybe there's a vested interest because they want to heal, but that's what we do know. And what we also know is he's creating and perfecting medical instruments and new technology from these women's bodies. So he doesn't, he doesn't develop or invent the speculum, but what he does is he creates a speculum that has a bivalve so that there is easier observation into the vaginal cavity so that you can see the fistula. I was never fun for my well women's exam because they would say, oh, well, what do you do? Well, let me tell you. Is that the so-and-so speculum, right? But this is the other thing. I have to tell you, to any grad student in here who is, run up against the wall, I remember calling archives, because I was at UCLA, not necessarily a treasure trove of, artifacts on slavery. So I would always have to travel to the South. And I remember, trying to set up these appointments. And even on the phone or via email, people would tell me, why don't you just study the Civil War? That's where most of the surgical innovations happened. One woman told me, I will never forget, there's just not enough. You could probably publish a pamphlet. I love being invited for their endowed lecture. That's the petty part of me. But I thought, well, the thing that I do know, for most of us, right? When you see something, you'll believe it sometimes more than the words on the page. Guess what the medical journals did? They whitened the patients. So all of a sudden, Sims's nurses are white, his patients are white, they're clothed. And so when you're seeing the illustrations, of course then they're telling me, there's not enough, there's nothing there. And I'm like, but the words say the negress, the Negro woman, the slave. It literally tells you this, but the illustrations say something different. So all of a sudden there becomes this erasure, right? They're effaced from the record. And so it becomes incumbent upon the historian or the scholar to try to put the pieces of the puzzle back as best you can, right? When it comes to the history of slavery, you're gonna always have missing pieces and gaps, but you try to make it as accurate and precise as possible. And so that brings us to this moment, right? What is the legacy of all of the stuff that I just discussed? What we know nationally, and this has rarely changed, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women. I've lived a lot of places since I published this book. This book was published when I was at Queens College in New York. I lived in Brooklyn, in Bed-Stuy. That number was 8 times higher. Then I moved to Nebraska, lived in Lincoln. In fact, the president came here, right? So your President Carter was the president when I was at UNL. Even in Lincoln and Omaha, the numbers mirrored 3 to 4 times. And I was like, well, my God, y'all ain't no Black people in Nebraska. I remember I would travel and people would say, you live in Nebraska? I was like, child, 3 of us, right? And yet the numbers still, right, pretty high. Ohio, same thing. And so how do we change this, right? How do we change this way of being, right? How do we change these stats? Because when the stats first started to be taken, it was actually done under the Reagan administration. There's a white Republican Secretary of Health who was really interested in racial health disparities. And so she partnered with a Black doctor who worked at Tuskegee, and they started collecting data. And so by 1985, Reagan, he opens up the Office for Minority Health Affairs, right? So literally, ever since we've been taking these stats, this has remained unchanged. But because I don't believe in nihilism, right? I always like to tell people when they say, well, what can we do? I like to show what people are doing. And not simply doctors, not simply activists, right? But just normal people. So this is Michelle Browder, and she is an artist, and she's someone who gave tours around the kind of Black Montgomery, Alabama history tours. Because I remember I was doing a documentary down there, we agreed to meet, and she picked me up from my hotel in a trolley, right? This is her life's passion. And so all of a sudden, she takes me to where those sculptures are, because she's an artist, and she says, I want you to see the sculptures I created, right, to honor Anaka, Betsy, and Lucy, the mothers of gynecology. And so we formed a partnership. She started having conferences. And then I remember maybe a year or two later, I was in Alabama for something, and she says, in her very Southern accent, Deirdre, I want you to come to my place. And I said, okay. I had to have dinner with the donors. I had to try and get some money. So after she picks me up, we go to her place. Well, her place is now a clinic, a museum, a community center that was once owned by James Marion Sims, where he performed those surgeries on Anaka, Betsy, and Lucy. Right? And so this was a woman not wealthy or anything, but she just wanted to honor these women in the best way she knew how as an artist. Right? Kimberly Seals Allers. She is a journalist. She had all the markers of kind of middle class respectability. She was married, and she went to Columbia for her graduate degree, and, had all of these things going on. Lived in Long Island, in Westchester, in a nice house, right? All of the things. And every time she would go to the hospital for her appointments, she wasn't treated with respect. She had a really tough time giving birth. I mean, just kind of all the things that I mentioned before she's experiencing. And so one day, she's, like many parents, she sends her son to coding camp for the summer. And she says, okay, so what did you learn today, blah, blah, blah. And he's telling her, she has this idea, because he's teaching his mom how to code. And she says, what if we develop an app with just her teenage son? So they developed the Earth app. She says she dropped the B for bias. And Kimberly and her son developed this app, which you can download, because they wanted Black and brown women to be able to track their experiences at every stage of pregnancy and postpartum, because the data did not exist. And then, I started off with the Kelly Hoffman sample of 267 medical residents and students. And because remember I said I have a little petty in me. I don't ever want anybody, that's a small sample. So I always end with a big sample. Almost 2 million people, right? Because I'm like, don't fuss with me, fuss with the researchers, right? Rachel Hardiman of the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. She conducts research on this single hospital in Florida. 1.8 million records from the late 20th century to the 21st. And what they find is when Black patients had Black practitioners at every level, and that included everybody, from doulas, midwives, OBGYNs, pediatricians, lactation specialists, I could go on and on and on. It literally cut the mortality and morbidity rate by 50%. It literally was that. It doesn't cut it to zero, but by 50%, because they didn't have to wade through a kind of anti-Black bias. And what I learned when I give these kinds of talks, I gave a talk not too long ago, maybe a month or so ago, at Kansas State University, I believe it was, in Wichita. And I was shocked. It was this beautiful building. I mean, all of these gadgets and things. And I was like, well, how did this happen? And so someone wanted to reinvest in the community. And so they created a pipeline program from the technical college to the four-year college to the med school, where all of those students would have access and get certifications, right, in the health allied field. So they literally created a pipeline for people in Wichita, Kansas and the surrounding areas. And so I thought, well, if they're prison, right, school to prison pipelines, as we found out by the Justice Department not too long ago in the state of Mississippi, surely we can create pipeline programs, right, where you have folk who look like they're patients who are also taking care of these people. It isn't hard to do, right? So I end there with, I always say, a little bit of hope. And I also quote the great late novelist, who was really a philosopher, but she wrote philosophy through fiction stories. But Octavia Butler often said, there's nothing new under the sun, but we can create new suns. And so that's my hope, that we can create new suns with the information that we have, with the inspiration that we have, and also from not simply seeing people as objects, but as subjects worthy of care and love. So I thank you. I welcome your questions and your comments.
Do you want to moderate?
And I think Dr.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
was enthusiastic.
I was enthusiastic about moderating.
the Q&A.
If there's any, maybe I'll take the opportunity to ask you a question since I'm holding the mic. I like that you ended with hope. I think that it's just really important for the audience to know that we face one of the worst. Right, we're only right behind Mississippi here in Ohio in terms of maternal morbidity and mortality.
You
can't hear.
Here, use this. We can.
Here in Ohio, African American women and babies have the second highest rate of morbidity and mortality, only behind Mississippi, almost in Miami. And so this isn't just like this isn't history, this is our current reality here in Columbus. And so, there's been really wonderful programs here called here in Ohio State, where they called Moms to Be. It's run by Dr. Dixon that I mentioned to you earlier, where they really bring together women and their children and offer them support in parenting classes. How can we, as physicians or scientists or historians, how can we come together and, there's such a history of well-earned distress, but how can, for example, how could I help that program grow and do research that could propagate that program? I think it's an incredible program and bring it nationally to help more moms and babies.
Yeah. Thanks, that's a great question. I've done some work with Case Western and some other independent organizations, and that's Cleveland. In Cleveland, just about a year or so ago. So I know it's some wonderful work coming out of Ohio. What I would say in terms of like medical schools, and then I'll get to the community organizations, is to incorporate more medical humanities. There's a overemphasis, and I understand why, on the science books, the medical books. But, as a historian who taught the history of the Western medical tradition, medicine began as the practice of an art, right? And it was a lot more holistic, if you read all of the Hippocrates and the Galen and all of that stuff, right? And so I think medical humanities is important because often the patients are saying they don't feel listened to, they don't feel heard. And so I think that if we have empathy for our patients, and it can be hard to not sit in judgment if you see someone making choices that may be dangerous or not healthy, but understanding that even if I smoke 10 vials of crack, if I burn myself, I still need help, right, regardless. And so that needs to be attended to. So I think that's the thing, right? Just being able to incorporate that thing that has become kind of a political lightning rod, empathy, but to incorporate empathy with our patients. In terms of community groups, I love when grassroots organizations kind of incorporate everybody from the community. I wish that hospitals could do that for their boards, that they could actually have members who are patients and community members who sit on the boards. It's important for people to write big checks, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have all the answers. And I would much rather, have a conversation and come up with resolutions from someone who has been a patient at the hospital and lives in that community and can give me that kind of, intimate knowledge around what people need in those communities. And the other thing is to, I think for all of us, find out what you're good at. I'm a historian, that's what I do. So you're never gonna find me, with a megaphone on the street corner. I'm too scared. I don't know how to fight. And so, I can't do that. When people ask me, I'm like, but what I can do is offer education. I can help to design learning modules and help to develop curriculum. Those are the kinds of things where I feel most comfortable and I can stay in my lane. And I know that people will appreciate it. So I just think that it's as, the resolutions are as diverse as we are. And then lastly, I'll say, when Black women created the term reproductive justice in 1994, it was about access, and it included every person in the community. And it is one of the most democratic and I think compassionate, activist-leaning doctrines that every last person could benefit from, because it's not about exclusion, it's about inclusion. And so I think reproductive justice, just understanding it and implementing it, could do a lot to turn those figures around, because it's not just Black women, but the stats for white women around mortality and morbidity have been getting progressively worse. So no one's safe in this country. The US is the most dangerous place to be pregnant and to have a baby, period.
I'm just bringing this to the YouTube, we're recording this, so. But you seem to project.
Okay.
So I know you, Sierra Phillips.
Hi, yes. So I'm a PhD student here at Ohio State, and I just wanted to ask you, based on like the conversation you just had with her about the medical school curriculum, have you ever had conversations with, I guess, medical school staff about having your book as something that their students read? And if you haven't, are you open to doing that or interested in doing that?
So I'll repeat, thank you, Sierra. I'll repeat your question for the audience. Have I had conversations with medical school faculty and staff around the inclusion of books like mine? Yes, I have. And the wonderful thing about books, I have to say, when this book was first published, I remember, literally having to like chase down my editors. I should say that the marketing people and PR people, because they thought, it's a book about the 19th century slavery, women's history, nobody will be interested. And I'm like, I know they're going to be interested. And so, my personality is, I just told my editor, I was like, look, give me the name and the number, because I need to talk to homeboy. So I said, look here, it was a Saturday morning, I'll never forget. I said, look here, I'm selling my books, I said, in bars and restaurants like people sold crack and illegal CDs in the 80s. I need y'all to push this book out. And so he says, I like you. I said, good, do something, push my book out there. For 3 years, it was the best-selling book in the University of Georgia Press's history. It was so impactful that they have created a series on Black women's history. Cynthia Greenlee is one of the editors. Unfortunately, the other editor died. She was a wonderful person, but they are pushing forward with that series. And so I tell people, buy books. Even when someone has like not a lot of money to give me, I say, you know what? It's better. I'm like, my taxes are already too high. Just, the $250 you were going to give me, buy $250 of my books and give it to the members of your organization, or create a library, right? And so often I tell my students, I'm like, look, we're not the field where you're going to be spending hundreds of dollars, right? These books are not that expensive. The books buying books makes a political impact for the authors when you buy those books. And so, here I am, almost 50,000 books sold without an agent or anything, because people were interested. So they have included them in curriculum, but not just for hospitals, doulas, midwives. ACOG, I helped to create learning modules with them. They were like, weren't you a fellow? Didn't we give you money back in the day? Come on and help us, right? Let's do these learning modules. And so those are the kinds of ways that we can, include our books. Sometimes I think academics are shy. I don't have a shy, retiring personality. I'm like, you need to read this because it's important. And I know it is, because people who are out on the streets, patients, mothers, daughters, fathers, they're all birthing people are all telling me the impact that my book and others like my book have made in their lives. So, you just, make those partnerships and make them buy your books.
And I also just want to say something real quick. I just really want to appreciate and say thank you to Dr. Cooper Owens, because she's the reason why I decided to study Black women's history. So, thank you.
I did not take her, I promise. questions, comments? Yes, sir. And
One of the things in studying history that we often see is that in things that in hindsight look very clear are not always so at the time. But I'm just wondering, to take Sims, for example, we can also then discover dissenting voices from those periods. And so what were, if there was debate or if there were challenges to what he was doing at the time, what form did those take, or how can we recover those?
that's a great question. It's almost, almost always I love primary sources because I'm like, Sims wrote about it himself. in his autobiography, The Story of My Life, he talked about his family members and neighbors, really trying to dissuade him from continuing the research. He said, I heard the whispers that I was using the women like guinea pigs. And then later, Nicole Ivey, who's a professor of art history and history at I believe it's George Washington University in DC, wrote a really wonderful article some years ago about Nathan Bozeman, his most vocal critic. But it was really about, whether Bozeman's button suture was better than Sims's silver suture method. But he said that Sims had essentially inflated the number of patients that he cured. And so there had been some debate. The other thing that was really interesting, though, where Sims gets the biggest pushback is when he founds the Women's Hospital of the State of New York, which, until my book was published, was known as the country's first hospital for women. And I was like, wait a minute, did y'all not read what the man said? That he had a little hospital built for himself in Alabama? But, I guess they didn't want to call the slave hospital for women the first. But I was like, So petty part of me, page 1, I listed. That's, that's my personality. But the board of directors fired him because he kept crowding the surgical rooms like it was not just like literal medical theater. And so they were just, they were like, no. So, to fire the founder of the hospital, there was a lot of pushback. Sir, yes. I saw your hand, please.
Abby and I work at a community health center here, and as you know, the history of community health centers comes out of the civil rights movement. And the first one that opened in the late 1960s was in Boston. And I'm presently reading. I'm presently reading.
We have to, that's for the YouTube, so you can talk in the.
Presently reading I see. Presently reading a fascinating book, a history called Out in the Rural, about the second community health center, which opened in the late 60s in the small black city of Mound Bayou in the Mississippi Delta part of the state of Mississippi. And it's an amazing story that comes out of a reaction to the disparities at that time.
Yes. And
it continues now. We've got over 1,400 of these community health centers across the United States. And you also remind me of the fact that to get the government funding, we're required to have at least 51% of the board members to be patients also. And they also demographically are required to reflect the people who we serve.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I have. Thank you for that. The woman who wrote that book, I was on her dissertation committee when I taught at Ole Miss, so I know exactly who you're talking about in Mound Bayou in Mississippi. Once again, as you mentioned, another wonderful example of community-based, it wasn't just health, but like community-based everything, education, but health becomes so important. And so they have their own nurses guild and doctors, and thank you so much. Katrina Rochelle Sims, it's just an amazing dissertation and book. So yes, I think you are offering information. I don't really have anything to say except here. I think it's wonderful if we can oftentimes look to what our ancestors left us. They were very clear blueprints. I have a really bad habit where I sometimes escape and look at social media, which I don't recommend. But, I like to, I teach young people, so sometimes I want to see, what's interesting to them, what are they doing? And there is a really, I think, disrespectful saying, we are not our ancestors, largely by young black people. with this assumption that Black people who lived before them were filled with fear and not proactive about anything. And I think it speaks to the poor education that some of these folk received. Because if you actually understood what our ancestors left us, these, people who literally just came out of slavery. Mound Bayou was a community that was given to a Black man who was the slave of, I forget, it was the president of the Confederacy. Thank you. I'm in the brain fog era of my life, I'll just say that. So sometimes I forget things. But, so it was given to Ben Davis was his name. So the land is given to Ben Davis and they turn it into Mound Bayou and it becomes this bustling community, much like a Rosewood in Florida or the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they did amazing things with little of nothing. And these were also people who were not afraid to defend themselves in Mississippi of all places. So when I see it, it breaks my heart because I was like, the one thing you actually would want to do is to emulate your ancestors, right? And so thank you for offering that up. I think it's a wonderful blueprint. Oh, I'm just gonna take it with me.
Thank you for a lovely talk. What aren't we measuring that we should? I think of advocacy certainly as the combination of data and stories. We're talking about women, we're talking about birth. We have the story. You wrongly mentioned staying in your lane. Knowing what you know for colleges of medicine, healthcare systems, Medicaid agencies, what aren't we measuring that we should?
So the reason I say staying in my lane, I have to be honest, I think a lot of folk, particularly for Black academics, we are asked to be experts at all things. If you knew all the talks that I've given in the past, before I'm like, no, this is what I'm doing. Basket weaving. I'm being serious because I'm a descendant of Low Country, Gullah, South Carolina folk. So I'm like, I don't know how to do this, but okay. And so I'm now at the point in my career where I'm like, I focus on reproductive justice, I focus on slavery, and I focus on Black women. And so I like to do things in a way where I can actually see that there are policy changes that are going to happen. So the curriculum changes in schools or speaking with doulas or midwives and seeing them have really robust curriculum. But there are others who have more capacious views of how to use their talents. And I also encourage that. I do think that the stories are important. I think that there's a way that this is resistive work. I know when I was in grad school, it was almost a sin to say that as a historian, you were also going to include and integrate storytelling. But I'm also a person with a master's degree in African American studies, and so that's always been important to me. That's how people are brought into it. But I do think that the quantitative data is needed. I think that we need to have partnerships. I mean, this is a very fraught political moment, so I don't know if we can, but this political moment is not going to be here forever. And what I would hope is that we can start to partner with some of the smaller county governments, particularly in rural spaces where we can just actually get data. We don't have data. For instance, I graduated from Williamsburg County in South Carolina, King Street Senior High School, and from 1990 until I think it was 2000, it was post-COVID, 2022 maybe, there was no maternity ward. There was no hospital where you could go to have a baby. I think you can do it on the edge of the county now, but most times you have to go to Florence County or Charleston or those places. And so there just isn't enough data, particularly in rural areas. And so I hope that those are the kinds of partnerships that can be formed, because it's very hard to do something when you don't have any numbers at all. The other thing from living in Nebraska for 4 years, there is very little data on indigenous communities. I mean, like at all. And so although the numbers are particularly damning for African Americans, I think they're probably worse for indigenous people, but we just don't have the data to back it up. So those are some of the things that, undergraduate students, high school students can go out and collect just the numbers. But it's also the funding, and that's another big issue. But thank you for that.
Another microphone.
Deirdre, I am so excited that you're here at OSU. I'm so happy to see you, and thank you for this phenomenal talk.
I know her too.
I came in a little late because I teach Black women in slavery and freedom, and some of my students are actually here. And we've been learning about these silences and these erasures, and a lot of us didn't grow up learning or weren't taught in high school or actually until doctoral work the names of Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, right? We didn't, it's history that we were not taught. What can you tell, particularly my undergraduate students, what can you tell them, or what is their role as students to ensure that the next generations or themselves don't grow up with these erasures, particularly not knowing the experiences of Black women or the names of Black women who had consequential contributions to the American story, right? What can they do as students? And I know this is like a very ambitious question, but the students are here and we're trying to learn, and so what can they do as students? Beyond reading your book and engaging?
That's the hard thing. It is a big question because unfortunately the rupture that COVID has produced, there are huge historical gaps with our students. And we're talking about a generation of young people who did not grow up necessarily reading books. So the access is on the phone or the tablet, getting the summary very quickly. And so I think sometimes for me, it's about how to capture their imaginations, create a rapport and a relationship where I can have them reconnect. Because the intellectual thirst is there, it's just in other, expressed in other ways, but how I can have them to maybe reconnect in ways that might seem boring and staid, but to let them know that education doesn't always have to be about edutainment. That's how you can maybe hook them. But sometimes you just gotta do the work, and you might fall asleep. Like I tell them, I was in that archives reading those old dusty papers, and I was like this. It was like so boring sometimes, but you do it because you have to. And so I think that you having the commitment to making sure that the gaps are lessened and lessened. So every class period, I'm teaching a writing intensive course on slavery and freedom, and most of my students, I say, well, what about the 19th Amendment? They don't know. What about Dred Scott? What about Harriet Tubman? What about Frederick Douglass? And they don't know. And so I try my best to not be judgmental and say, okay, well, this is an opportunity for us to learn this thing, and here are the takeaways. And for me, the way that I capture them is also making them recognize how it can resonate in this political moment. So for instance, Dred Scott, I said, how many of you have read about birthright citizenship? A few of them. And I was like, well, this is where it started. Dred Scott. Okay, let's talk about how Dred Scott and slavery and these judicial cases, right, creates this thing that we're contending with in the 21st century. And then it starts, you can see them putting it together. But it's hard. And we just have to, I think all of us have to just really do more work and harder work, even though we're fatigued. But that's what we do. So that's what I would tell the students. And then I know there's this woman here who's been patient.
That's fine. I just wanted to make people aware that probably a lot of people here knew Dr. Quinn Capers, who was Dean of Admissions at the Medical College for quite some time, and did a lot of education about implicit bias within the medical college community and elsewhere for all types of implicit bias, and has a marvelous test out on the internet that you can Google and find and learn probably some surprising things about yourself. but there is a scholarship at the College of Medicine intended for students who might struggle to be able to get into medical college because of implicit biases. So you can always go to OSU Advancement, and it's something that is being worked on locally to try and help get patients, have physicians who look like themselves.
That's wonderful. OSU Advancement, scholarship, implicit bias. I'm trying to, all right, applied research.
It's the Aspire Medical Research Program, and it's a wonderful pathway program for Ohio State undergrads who are from historically excluded backgrounds. Any last questions? I think this doesn't work. I did my best.
That's okay. I think the gentleman.
There's a radio play on related topics that the LA Theater Works produced that's accompanied by an interview with you that we can all listen to on their website. And,
Of me? Oh, I didn't.
I believe so.
I never listen to myself or watch myself, so I believe you. I never do, because I'm like, I was there, but I believe you, so thank you.
LA Theater Works.
Oh, thank you.
You didn't get enough today.
No, this is great. That's what I said I wanted. Conversations, comments, people offering up advice, people offering up gentle correctives. I mean, this is how it started, just to have those kinds of conversations. So thank you so much. I can't believe we actually ended on time. So this is amazing. Thank you very much.